to Out of Left Field. As always, we are podcasting from the Gulag Archipelago of Soviet Kanakistan, otherwise known as Vancouver Island. And we got Leigh Phillips back on the show. Welcome back. Thank you for coming.
Hi there.
And we also got our comrade Yennefer on the show as well. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, pals.
So, and of course, with us as always is Mac.
Yeah, me too.
And,
I'm also here.
and myself. So, we're going to be talking about free speech today. Interesting timing, because just a quick shout out to a fellow left-wing Canadian politics podcast, News You Can Use. Just also recently, coincidentally, had an episode on free speech. We've actually, Leigh and ourselves have been planning on doing this episode for actually quite a while, so the timing is a neat little coincidence. And I guess we'll be giving a slightly different perspective on the issue.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, to be fair, though, it if anything, has only become more and more timely as time has gone on, unfortunately.
Sure. So I guess just to start, let's just dive right into it. Leigh, a number of years ago after the Charlie Hebdo massacre in France, you wrote a opinion piece on free speech, and why don't you just tell us a little bit about that, and we'll take it from there. Let's just give a quick, Cole's notes, what happened. I guess the Charlie Hebdo published some cartoons of Muhammad or something like that, and some Islamists gunned down their offices and killed a bunch of people.
Sorry, it's probably a bit more complicated than that. Over the years, Charlie Hebdo is a radical left publication, comes out of the late 1960s, 68 sort of generation, and in France, there is a very strong anti-clerical tradition, which we don't really have as much of in the Anglophone world, largely because of our Protestant sort of heritage, I guess one could say. Yeah, no, I would chuckle at that as well. But so we never, precisely because the Anglophone world had developed the sort of religious origins of the modern Anglophone world are Protestant. They are or were anti-Catholic, for good or for ill, and we can talk about sort of problems with that, obviously. But Ireland, cough. We never needed to develop any sort of anti-clerical tradition because the foundation of the sort of modern English state, if you will, begins with a sort of anti-Catholic tradition. So we don't, the sort of anti-clerical thread within left-wing discourse was never as necessary in the Anglophone world as it was in France or Italy or Spain or Portugal.
And Quebec, actually.
Absolutely. Quebec's another great example of that. And we probably see that today in terms of that Quebec maintains this strong anti-clerical tradition. So Charlie Hebdo, even though it was steeped in a sort of radical left, almost anarchist perspective, it always had this very, as I said, very, very strong anti-clerical aspect to its reportage and the cartoons that it had in it. One of the things that people forget, people think of it as just a newspaper full of cartoons, which it largely is, but it also has a very, very serious reportage. They have uncovered a range of corruption scandals. They write regularly about environmental issues. If anything, I would say I actually have quite a bit of a disagreement with many of the takes that Charlie Hebdo has had on environmental issues. I think they very much fall too much into the sort of deep green perspective. They're anti-nuclear. So anyway, so that's the sort of background of what Charlie Hebdo is. So as a result of this anti-clericalism, they would regularly have cartoons that mocked people of any religion, including Islam, but also Judaism and Christianity. And in fact, the majority of the cartoons in which religious figures were mocked were actually Christian, Catholic figures. However, because they also mocked Islamic religious figures, there is a number of Anglophone leftists who, by and large, don't speak French. Some of them do, but generally viewed those as Islamophobic. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I would say that I do think that there is a difficulty with respect to, is it right to engage in such mocking in a period when Muslims in Europe are faced with enormous Islamophobic oppression? That's an interesting question. We can have a conversation about that. But I would not say that the mocking of the Islamic figures in their cartoons was in any way Islamophobic. It was just anti-clerical. And I think a lot of Anglophone leftists misread that. And then there were a number of other cartoons as well as a result of that. But when the cartoonists and journalists and editors, copy editors and so on, who were massacred by these Islamist militants, this was absolutely horrific. Even if they were racist, which they weren't, you just stand up and you just like you defend journalists and cartoonists against anybody who would try to censor you, period. But if they're trying to censor you through the final censorship of death, the very first thing you do is you express your solidarity with them, that you declared that this is not acceptable, that we have to stand up to this. And unfortunately, there were a number of prominent leftists in North America and in the UK that, it was sort of, mealy-mouthed, well, of course this is terrible, but we have to realize that this was a racist publication, effectively saying they had it coming to them.
It was wrong, but what did they think was going to happen?
Exactly. Exactly. Which I felt was absolutely grotesque, and I thought it was a good moment to. And I was not the only one. I've just been posting this on Facebook because I was very frustrated to see in my feed that there were a number of comrades of mine that were expressing this sentiment. And somebody from Ricochet magazine, the Canadian online left-wing publication, one of the editors there said, who was feeling a very similar way to the way that I did, which is that whatever they did, we need to stand up and defend journalists and cartoonists against censorship. Also, they weren't racist anyway. They're actually comrades of ours. This was a radical left-wing publication. We need to step up. And it was... So what happened with Ricochet was that one of the editors emailed me and said, or messaged me privately and said, I totally agree with you. I think this is really appalling. Can you write this up as an essay for Ricochet? So I did that. And I sort of extended it into a broader discussion of free speech and how actually free speech is not a conservative position or a liberal position. It is at its origin a left-wing position. We were the ones who have always historically articulated this, that it's the first freedom, that we can't do anything else that we want to do. We can't organize a picket line. We can't publish our newspapers or magazines, our articles or anything else. We cannot organize if we do not have the right to say whatever we want to say.
So that was the main point of your article, basically, that free speech is the most important freedom, whether it's for conservatives or socialists or whoever.
It's not so much that it's the most important freedom, although it is. It's that it's the first freedom.
The first one, okay.
And I really want to stress that we can't do anything else if we don't have... There's no freedom of association if there's not freedom of speech. So there's no free trade unions if there's not free speech.
And this, I mean, what you're saying there, and I mean, the article about the whole Charlie Hebdo thing is a few years old now, and a lot's happened since then. But the most popular opinion on the left these days seems to be no platform for fascists.
Yeah, I guess all I would want to say just first is just like, I think that the whole Charlie Hebdo thing did kind of put this whole question into a... I guess it kind of exposed what people's opinions had been all along on the left in a certain way, and then sort of the consequences of the whole no platforming movement seem to be a lot more obvious now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. I don't think that people really talked about it too much. It was bubbling away, but I do think it was Charlie Hebdo which actually broke open the left. I wouldn't say that the most popular idea on the left is no platforming, but I do think the left is very much divided on this question. And as a result, I think the spark for that division was Charlie Hebdo.
I think there's a distinction to make when it comes to the whole no platforming movement and where most of that is coming from and where the left is at right now, because the no platforming movement is almost entirely contained within, universities, really, realistically.
Well, no, I don't know if that's true. I think that
No?
that has, I think it's spread far beyond the university these days. I think that there are galleries and theaters and mainstream politicians now that are beginning to, that precisely because the left, I think, on campuses and in left-wing commentators in the media have given license to the idea that something should be censored, that this is now this has escaped the campus.
All right.
So, for example, when the Canadian government or the Ontario government, I think it was the Ontario government, was discussing whether or not to actually introduce legislation to ban BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, organizations that are critical of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. That's not the campus left anymore. That's mainstream liberal and conservative politicians now that are adopting this discourse of no platform. That there are some ideas that are so reprehensible that we can ban them, that we can no platform them. And I think I definitely think that it's the left that's given these people license to do that.
What is your argument against the no platform position, basically? Like, why do you think? Because from my perspective, I mean, there is a difference to be made between free speech and hate speech, right? Flying the Nazi flag.
Do you really think that?
I do, because I think, you can't, I mean, hate speech is advocating for violence. It's advocating for genocide. It's advocating for the killing of millions of people.
But fair enough. But the common argument, and I'll just say this is the probably most simplest argument about specifically against violence, is every single person who advocates to go on strike is advocating violence against their boss in a very material way, like in the sense that their boss can and does say that those workers are basically stealing from me by fucking over my business, that picket line is inherently a physical line that you can't physically cross, which is a physical violence, quote unquote, that those strikers are doing to any scabs or management that wants to cross that line.
Yeah, but
we just before we started here, we had this conversation about this left-wing indie media website in Germany,
right?
And the German, I think it's the German government that has shut that down. And the argument that they made as to why it should be shut down was because, quote unquote, they advocated violence. That is to say, they advocated the overthrow of the bourgeois state.
Well,
blah, blah, blah.
they were publishing.
No, this is really important, because if one of your rationales as to why it is legitimate to ban hate speech is that they've advocated violence, well, the left could be said to be advocating violence as well in terms of revolution. What is a revolution?
Yeah. No, I see what you mean, but I mean, and this is where I sympathize with your position here, because when the website The Daily Stormer was taken offline last year, after the Charlottesville episode, and
you might want to say what Daily Stormer is.
Yeah, well, Daily Stormer's neo-Nazi website, and
fairly famous one,
bunch of shitheads, and
yeah, but we can't assume that everybody. Like, we got to be able to speak beyond our... we know...
the wiki page.
What the Daily Stormer is.
Yeah, but it was...
my mom doesn't know what the Daily Stormer is.
It was a hive of scum and villainy of neo-Nazi shitheads that celebrated the death of Heather Heyer after Charlottesville. And for that reason, that specific reason, their domain registrar took them offline. And so then they went to another domain registrar and another one, and they became poison. They were just, they were
I think that's
pariah.
really unfortunate. I think that's really, really unfortunate, because what that's done is that set a precedent that now any web service provider or any sort of tech company or anything like that, and let's be honest here, today, the way that the public square where we converse is online. So effectively now what that is doing is the minute that any private company is basically it's just the reason they're doing this is not because they give a fucking rat's ass about violence or whatever. It hurt their brand.
It's a PR thing.
It's a PR thing.
But I just want
so the minute that anything else that hurts their brand, like some left-wing blog post or left-wing newspaper or anything
or
like
a
that.
podcaster
who,
who, for instance, has remarked several times on this podcast that he was
happy.
happy that Anton Scalia died.
Yeah, that's true.
For instance, just as a coincidental example.
We are opening the door. It is ideological suicide. The minute that we say that it is acceptable to ban some kinds of speech, hate speech, the worst kinds of speech, we are committing ideological suicide. We're allowing our opponents to censor us.
Yeah,
and they will do it within days, within weeks.
I just wanted to finish that. Yeah, I just wanted to finish that point because, like, everybody on the left celebrated when the Daily Stormer was taken offline, and then 2 fucking weeks later, the indie media in Germany got taken down, and it was because they were publishing guides on how to make Molotov cocktails and shit, right? And so I wouldn't necessarily call those direct action anarchists my comrades per se, but
no, I think that's a load of adventurous bullshit. But they have the right to publish their adventurous bullshit.
And not for nothing, but you can literally go down to pretty much any single public library on this entire continent and find a manual that will tell you that anyway.
Yeah,
it's not hard to find.
Much more. I mean, that's. Okay, well, you could imagine some liberal saying, "Well, of course we should ban hate speech, and of course we should ban that stuff as well."
Of course, yeah.
But here's the thing: it's when we're talking about something like BDS, that's a little bit more subtle, isn't it? So there are a number of Likudnik, like pro current Israeli government organizations on campuses who view boycott, divestment, and sanctions to be hate speech. They view it to be anti-Semitic. I don't think it is. I don't
totally
necessarily
not.
agree
No.
completely with the entirety of the perspective. I'm sort of with Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein on this, and that I have some issues strategically and tactically with whether BDS works, nevertheless, I certainly don't think those people are anti-Semitic. But precisely because we've opened the door to this, campus administrations, the Ontario government, a number of other agencies or actors in society have now viewed themselves to be given license to ban that on the basis of somebody somewhere said this is hate speech. Who gets to decide what is hate speech?
Well, this is where I would probably differentiate myself from both of you, in that I think that that's probably the more important. That to me is the important question, is how these decisions get made. Because I do think that there are times when it may very well be necessary to ban certain things from being.
Why? What would those examples be?
I don't really know. It's off the top of my head. I can't.
Well, come on. You got to.
Well, no, but my point isn't about the specific speech. It's about how it's actually being done, how these bans are taking place, and they're being done through just bureaucratic maneuvering or the government or the police.
Or private
point. No,
companies in the case of the Daily Stormer, right? Why should we have private companies dictating what we can or can't read online?
Absolutely.
Like, whether or not we
Absolutely.
agree with, like, sure, the Daily Stormer were a bunch of fucking fascist shitheads.
Absolutely.
And I celebrated with everyone else, but
you shouldn't have done. You shouldn't have done, because what you're doing is you're opening. What we're facing at the moment, if we're just want to stay on the level of tech companies, I would say things like, discussions by Facebook and Google where they are restricting access to certain. I mean, it started with the Chinese government requesting, and I think Saudi Arabia and Pakistan as well might have done it. Certainly the Chinese government requesting Google to restrict access to certain websites that were, critical of the Chinese Communist Party. And they did it. And everybody at the time was like, this is appalling. How could you do this? This is, Google, you're capitulating because you're a private company and you need to make money in China. You need access to that market. But now they're beginning to do it here as well. And this is the public square. And so we need I would say that one of the burning issues before us at the moment is the fact that the modern public square is online, but the public square is owned by private companies in a number of different places in the Western world. what has been the public square is now privately owned by shopping malls, basically. People hang out in shopping malls, or even there's now like open shopping malls, but still, people can walk through, and it's relatively, effectively 24/7 you can walk through. But because it's technically private space, the companies that own these shopping malls have said, well, this is a private space. We can say what goes on, what doesn't go on in these places.
They own the infrastructure.
So they have banned buskers or restrictions on buskers, political leafleting of any kind. And a number of courts have said, actually, no. If this has 24-hour access to the public, it is effectively a public space. And they've struck down their ability to censor in those spaces. I think we should be celebrating that, and I think we should be trying to use those those legal findings as the basis, as precedents for trying to extend that principle to the online realm, to begin to restrict the ability of the Googles and the Facebooks, Instagrams, and so on and so forth to restrict public speech, because effectively that is now the public sphere, the public square.
Well, yes, and I just want to I agree with you there, but I just want to add specifically to Victoria. I don't think UVic is a particularly bad example of defending free speech or being anti-free speech, but specifically there, for reasons we don't really need to get into, it's not allowed for any non-approved organization to even just sort of be at UVic in any capacity whatsoever. So you can't leaflet, you can't get petitions signed unless you're approved either by the student union or by the university administration.
I think we should go into that. I think it's a really great example.
But I think that's a specific example of how this actually ends up resulting.
Yeah, it ends up screwing us.
But I just don't want to be, because I generally like UVic for the most part.
No. Okay, I work at UVic,
Yeah.
But thankfully, I think hopefully there's strong academic freedom protections in my collective agreement. So I think I should be free to be able to say this without any repercussions.
Let's hope so.
Let's hope so.
Continue on.
But what happened at the University of Victoria actually has international resonance. It's not a local specificity. There was a campus anti-choice organization, a religious anti-abortion organization, and the University of Victoria Student Society, the student union, did not want them to be leafleting, protesting on campus.
Sure.
And they pulled their funding as a student club, and they banned them from speaking. And I think the university went along with this, although I'm not exactly sure what role the university itself played. But this went all the way to the BC Supreme Court. And the BC Supreme Court, unfortunately, because Canada actually has really poor free speech protections compared to the United States and the UK and France. We actually, this is another thing that a lot of Canadians might not know, but we don't have very strong free speech protections. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms expressly allows for the inhibition of the freedom of expression for, I can't remember exactly what the restrictions are, but basically it's, for all intents and purposes, because of those get-out clauses, there is no free speech in Canada. It's basically whatever we have a sort of convention. They can choose. Exactly. So it was upheld, or the ability to restrict the ability of this. I think it was called Youth Protecting Youth, this anti-choice organization. It was upheld. It was all right for them to ban them. Now, as a result of that, not just the University of Victoria Student Society, the UVSS, but also the university itself now is very, very anxious about any disruptive speech on campus. Now, it's a campus, so there's all sorts of activism that goes on. But if there's anything that is not officially endorsed, they will march you off campus. And I remember this happened to me specifically about 2 years ago. I was on campus. I actually work on campus. I'm also a student on campus. And I was there with Fight for 15, which is the organization fighting for a just minimum wage. Well, I would say $15 an hour.
A better minimum wage.
A better minimum wage. And we were there leafleting with a number of different trade unions, including the unions that represent workers on campus. But we hadn't checked with the UVSS or the university before we did this. We thought it'd be fine. Why would there be any problem? I mean, it probably wouldn't been a big problem to get permission, but like we shouldn't have to do that anyway. And the campus security came up to us and said, "Do you have permission to leaflet here?" And we said,
And you didn't lie.
"No, we didn't lie."
That was your mistake.
We said, "There's nothing wrong with what we're doing," and they marched us off campus.
Yeah.
And so, precisely as a result of this thing that the left-wing University of Victoria Students' Union wanted to do to restrict bad speech against abortion, ended up biting us in the ass in that we were not allowed to issue effectively pro-trade union, pro-living wage literature on campus.
Well, sure, and anytime the school administration has some kind of whenever there's an actual issue going on, that's exactly the kind of environment in which they won't want disruptive protests or leafleting or any kind of thing. Like if there's ever going to be a strike or any issue with student fees or anything like that, same kind of shit.
Exactly. We've just opened the door now to the university administration clamping down the next time there's any serious potential strike movement or student activism. Mm. Sorry, you were going to say something.
Oh, no, I was going to say, if the only counterpoint to this whole subject of free speech and, is the crowds demanding what they want to hear and what they don't, is the influence of other sources on those crowds. I was thinking specifically of like Sinclair Broadcast Group, where you have these sort of messages being sent out into the world and just absorbed by masses of people and regurgitated in the form of protests against things that are actually legitimate and should be aired, views of other individuals specifically. So I was just thinking through sort of there's no way to determine how these things are actually being generated without a huge amount of investigation and consideration. So
this is a great point. Who is going to do that investigation?
Exactly.
Who do we trust that is perfect? Which human is able to assess? Like I'm the great human. I can.
You're great, Leigh. And go on.
I can assess this, and I won't be. I won't do it. I won't use this power in a bad way the next time. Like,
promise?
Do we really trust university administrations? Do we really trust the cops? Do we really trust the Canadian state to be doing this? Because that's what we're doing when we do this. We're opening the door for we're basically saying we trust the Canadian state to be objective in assessing what is good speech and bad speech. We trust the cops to be able to assess what is good speech and bad speech. Has that ever happened in the history of capitalism?
If we actually, and I think this is a good point to make, is like how if we're restricting free speech, and what speech are we restricting, who gets to decide that? So, in my mind, and Mac, I think you would agree on this, that there is some basis for democratic decision making. So, for example, if a community association, if there is a neo-Nazi march planned in some neighborhood, and that community association says, "Fuck no, you're not going to be using our streets to promote your hateful ideology. Get the fuck out of our town." If you democratically decide as a community that you don't want those fucking Nazis in your turf, then is that not justified?
Yeah, it's a hard call.
Yes, but the community in that case does what should be happening, which is mobilizing themselves to directly oppose that thing. And that's what I would consider to be, when I'm talking about like the democratic decision making to oppose and in theory restrict people's free speech. And maybe this is sort of a blurring of the line here, but I don't consider it to be fundamentally different in restricting a person's free speech one way or the other. Because if we're going to protest, counter protest a fascist march, and as a consequence of that fascist march doesn't take place or gets disrupted, or who the fuck cares, right?
Yeah.
Then they'll say, our free speech was, hurt and blah 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 blah. Well, but that's the point where they would, because this is the problem with a lot of this stuff, is a lot of it is just carping for your own particular side in many cases, and the fascists will say, whether it was an actual violation of their free speech or whether it was like the community they wanted to march through saying, no, fuck off.
I think it is. I do think there's I do think the crucial distinction that we need to make in these cases is that march threatening violence?
Right.
In that case, chasing them off the streets, that's absolutely warranted. I think the classic example of this is the Orangemen in the north of Ireland, when they marched through the Protestant loyalist paramilitaries and their sympathizers, when they're marching through Catholic neighborhoods. They are, like, let's be very clear. What they're doing there is they're intimidating the local populations. It is an expressly violent provocation. And for the local community to counter-mobilize and say, no, you're not marching through our neighborhoods, I think that's absolutely fine. But it is a gray area, because if it were simply that they had these bad ideas and they were marching through the streets, it's a public area, you kind of got to let them. That doesn't mean you can't mobilize against them, but you can't obstruct them. And that's the gray area. But the thing is, these paramilitaries are not doing it. They're not. It's not simply freedom of speech. They are violently intimidating these people. And that's where the difference happens. Because if we go too far in the other direction, then what we're saying is when Milo Yiannopoulos at Berkeley was shut down by the mob, by a left-wing mob, chased out of not being able to speak, that was acceptable? No, that wasn't acceptable. He has the right to say his bullshit ideas. We should absolutely protest it. Absolutely. Yeah. But the minute that we try to prevent his speaking, but if he was actively engaged in violence, that's a different. The
problem, though, is that a lot of this does depend on an administration that is more concerned about PR stuff. So when Milo gets shut down, it's not he's getting shut down. It's the administration often going, this is like way too much of a bad thing, so fuck off.
Too much of a hassle, even.
Okay. At the same time, let's be very clear here. There were left-wing activists, let's say, pseudo-leftists.
Air quotes you're
using
Air
quotes,
there,
sorry, yeah.
Oh,
nobody can see that on the radio or on podcasts. But, they were beating people up. I'm sorry, but that's a little bit more than just the university administration being scared, and that's out of order.
No, fair enough. I mean, the ideal situation for someone like Milo, particularly, is like, you hold a counter protest and a counter speech, and like, fucking, here's why this guy's a complete dickhead.
Absolutely.
And what's so funny, and I guess this is kind of why I'm often frustrated by a lot of the left being, I don't know, even just scared, I guess, of these guys, is how vapid and terrible and often just clearly self-serving their, let's face it, book tours often are.
Oh, yeah.
Like Milo, Jordan Peterson, these guys are like basically just selling themselves.
It's actually it should be really easy to intellectually disable their arguments. I mean, there was a great comment by Bernie Sanders like 2 or 3 days ago.
Yeah, I saw that.
Where he was discussing whether people should shut down Ann Coulter, this right wing. I mean, she's a Republican. She's not far right. She's just a regular old horrible Republican.
There's millions of them.
And he said, people who, I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said that people who want to shut her down suggest to me that they're some sort of intellectual weakness, that you don't have your arguments in line, like you don't have your ducks in a row.
Yeah.
Like you don't know exactly how to argue with her, so you just shut her down. You should go there. And there's 2 things you should do. Absolutely have a protest outside. When they're saying racist or misogynist or homophobic or transphobic shit, absolutely protest outside. And then make sure that there's somebody in the audience or people in the audience who go up and ask really hard questions, disable their argument, because actually these guys, their arguments are pretty shit. It's really easy to disable them. And what you have there is the other thing that you should be thinking about is all of the folks in the audience that are there because, oh, yeah, Milo, he's finally telling the truth. And maybe they haven't heard this other argument. And then you... The counterpoint. All they hear is like, oh, those fucking SJWs outside are trying to shut us down. Oh, but what if there's an SJW inside who's really clever and makes a really strong argument? And suddenly, oh, yeah, that totally makes sense. Now, maybe you're not going to win everybody, but there will be some people in the audience that you will win.
Yeah. In your article, I'm sort of paraphrasing, but you made an interesting point that, this free speech requirement is necessary to facilitate sort of the symptoms of transition, of groups in dynamic positions interacting with each other. And if the free speech isn't allowed, you can't have those interactions at all.
That's the alpha and omega of my argument. Absolutely. We can't have these, we can't be able to defeat their arguments without this. If we really think that fascism because Milo Yiannopoulos is not a fascist, he's just a nasty right-wing guy.
He's just a shithead.
He's just a right-wing shithead.
Egotistical idiot.
Whether we're talking fascism
saying.
or right-wing shitheads or just regular right-wing ideas, if we think that we can get rid of their ideas by censoring them, you're having a laugh. It's just not going to happen.
It hasn't happened.
That's the other thing. It's never happened.
We've had a whole period where maybe it's not the dominant trend on the left, but it's at least, no platforming has been at least applied pretty commonly, and there hasn't been any real, there's been no fruits from it. Like, we haven't seen the end of any of the things that have been no platformed anywhere.
The only way
at all.
The only way that we've ever defeated bad ideas is by winning the argument.
Right.
Well,
nobody
presenting better ideas.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we didn't ban pro-slavery speech. We won the fucking argument.
Well, and there was, and then eventually a civil war in the States, but
the reason that there was because we won the bloody argument.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
When if all of these discussions, on both sides are occurring as a result of these tensions, to shut down an outlet on one side just sort of castrates that group further, like further entrenches them in their frustration.
Oh, they love it. This is a great argument. That what Milo Yiannopoulos and all these other characters, their entire careers are built on
castration,
provoking the SJW left to have some shutdown protest, and then they can go on like Tucker Carlson and Fox News and all this stuff and say, "Oh, I'm being oppressed. Oh, the left, they're so terrible." There is an anti-free speech industry at the moment that the right wing is like making tons of money off of.
This is something that I wanted
They love this. This is the best thing you can do to promote people like Milo Yiannopoulos or whoever is to try to shut them down.
Yeah, you're falling right into their fucking anglerfish trap, right? And this is something that I wanted to ask was that do you think the anti-free speech tendency on the left is actually pushing people towards the right?
We have absolutely walked into their trap.
The
more that we do this, they love this. They say that they hate it, but they want it.
Milo is a professional provocateur,
exactly,
and I feel like, do you think that this, the free speech police, like you said, SJWs, is this tendency not actually pushing more people into the right? To the right than we're actually like. Is it?
Yeah.
Is it, or are they losing the battle for us essentially?
Oh no, absolutely. It really is deeply unfortunate. There's a range of people who, since the 2008 economic crisis, millions of people, particularly young people, have become really radicalized by the inability of our economic system to deliver us
anything,
basically. Stagnating wages, we can't afford housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Since 2008, that has pushed so many young people into questioning whether capitalism is viable. It has pushed lots of young people into supporting Occupy and then Sanders. Black Lives Matter, absolutely, I'm sure is a part of this. Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France. This is probably the best way to destroy that mobilization, because I've read so many times online young people who were like, I was really into Bernie Sanders. Like, I knocked on doors for him, and then I just I went, and then I was in this like activist community, or like, and everybody was just like shutting me down, and everybody's like groupthink, and this is crazy, and they like anti-free speech and and it was. I think this is incredibly dangerous. It's almost as if, like, if I didn't know better, I would suggest that these people, these sort of like SJW types, I kind of hate that phrase now, even though social justice warrior was originally a term of endearment on the left for some of our more, let's say, colorful comrades.
Enthusiastic.
More enthusiastic comrades. I kind of hate it now, but because it's been adopted by the right. But if I didn't know better, I would. If this were the 1960s and we were actually kind of a serious movement, I would kind of say, well, who's the cop in the room?
Oh, come on! Let's not get into the whole Count Intel Pro bullshit.
Count Intel
right?
Pro, yeah. I mean, I'm joking to some extent, but my serious point is that. Yeah, I think that the anti-free speech, the anti-civil liberties, the sneering at the idea of civil liberties and free speech by, let's call it the social justice warrior left. I mean, as I was saying, I hate that phrase.
For lack of a better term.
Yeah, it's the best way to discredit us, because let's be honest here, free speech and civil liberties are deeply popular in the United States, in the Western world in general, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's a result of the left's success over the last 300 years that we've convinced people deeply in their hearts that free speech is important, and what we're showcasing here is that the left seems to not be in favor of these things that people really, really love.
Well, it does. I mean, the idea of sort of freedom in general is just sort of the ability to live your life the way you want to, which in theory is what the social justice warriors are always putting forward, and the conservative right wingers are always criticizing. And yet people like Milo rightly point out this kind of hypocritical attitude. It's like, you want everyone to be however they want to be, but not me. Or whoever, and then it kind of just folds back into this stupid, just myopic, poisonous. Like I guess I would say, like, it's one of the things in discourse on the left, on the right, whatever, that has just really put me off a lot of shit. Just this whole fucking situation. And I do think free speech is important, but it has really just fucking pissed me off more than anything else. Because I'm just like, oh, fucking, who cares? I don't even know anymore. I don't care. Just, fuck it. Just go away. Stop talking about this shit. These people are clearly idiots, and these people are assholes. And that's it. And then I'm done.
Right.
And
oh yeah, that's how a lot of people are feeling. I'm feeling that way. A lot of my friends are like, I'm done. I got this one good friend. He's like, I just like, don't get me wrong, I'm gonna be a fucking socialist to the day I die, but like, I'm just taking a breather. Like, I just can't deal with this anymore. This is crazy.
It's funny. I saw this. I was doing a little bit of reading and researching before the recording of this, and I found this episode of Crossfire from like the 1980s where Frank Zappa was being just fucking berated by these conservative shitheads in their like dumpy ass with their dumpy stupid glasses, and like
three wads of mashed potatoes and suits were arguing with Frank Zappa over free speech.
We're talking about content of the words.
Oh, you don't think words connote ideas, huh?
Yes, they can be assembled into sentences and get ideas.
Well, how about
across.
answering my question about incest? Do you support records that promote incest as just another kind of sex, or in some instances it might even be preferable? Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with it. I have no interest in incest, but I don't think that anybody in his right mind would desire to have the government step in to make sure that they install a censor board that keeps certain things from being said.
Let me ask you something, Mr. Zappa.
Because sometimes the dumbest thing that gets said makes the point for you. And if a person is doing a song about incest, it gives you a chance to say, maybe incest is really wrong. I didn't realize that incest was such a terrible problem in the United States that we suddenly needed government intervention to cure incest in America by keeping words off of records.
Well, of course, incest in America didn't used to be such a terrible problem, did it, Mr. Zappa?
Say whatever you will about Frank Zappa's politics. One of my favorite quotes from him, one of my favorite quotes ever is, without deviation from the norm, progress is not possible. And so basically they were berating him for, the evil ideas that he's putting into the youth's mind. And in this case,
mostly.
In this case, it was the conservatives that were trying to silence free speech. And fast forward 30 years, and all of a sudden now it's the liberal campus left who are the ones that are trying to police speech and trying to shut people down for spreading, insidious ideas. And I just find it so ironic that the change.
It's more than ironic. I would say that it is. If you are anti-free speech, you are not on the left. I'm going to be that hard on this. In the same way that, if you're a racist, I'm sorry. I don't care if you're pro-trade union. No, you're not a leftist. If you're against democracy, I don't care how anti-racist you are. You're not on the left. I take there's 4 sort of main lines of what we do as socialists. One, obviously, we want to overthrow capitalism.
Socialism.
Socialism. But in the here and now, as we move towards the glorious day, you have to be a trade unionist. You have to be a Democrat. You have to be anti-oppression. You cannot support racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia. You can't do that and be a leftist. And the final thing is, you have to be for civil liberties. That's everything that we do, on a day-to-day basis, and it's what we've done for 300 years. So if it's waking up to when you say that you watch this thing from 30 years ago, 40 years ago, on Crossfire, and it's fast forward 30 years later, and it's a reverse. That's not the left. They may call themselves left, but if they are against free speech, they're not on the left. In the same way that if they were racist, they would not be on the left. We would have to say you're not.
Okay,
you're not
I have an interesting nuance to that point, though, because and I hate to use Reddit as an example, but there are some...
Go on.
But I will. There are some left-wing subreddits that, and I won't say which ones, but in order to...
Our socialism?
In order to combat, in their mind, in combating ableism, so discrimination against the disabled, you're not allowed to say words like dumb or stupid, and they get auto-deleted. And so if I wanted to say something like Donald Trump is a fucking stupid bag of shit, that would get auto-moderated for under the guise of policing, ableism.
You should have just called him a bag of shit.
Come on, this is going too far. This is ridiculous.
I'm sorry, it's not stupid. It's
dumb and it's stupid. It's you know what it also is? It's fucking crazy. It's mad.
The weirdest thing that ever happened to me. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me on Reddit was I was in an argument with someone. I won't say the subreddit, it doesn't matter. But I was in an argument with someone about immigration, and I said, if you're good enough to work here, you're good enough to stay. Basically, if you can work in Canada, you should be a citizen.
For the temporary foreign worker program.
Yeah, that was in reference to that and a bunch of other things. And I was banned for being ableist
because you said work.
Yes. And I was like,
Jesus, what the fuck?
Oh.
So
no, this is
that's just this dumb anecdote for what probably was just one person. I don't think that's necessarily indicative of a whole lot. But yeah, that if that happened, for me, it doesn't matter. But for someone who, say, goes to a meeting for the first time or a protest for the first time and says, goes out there with, a fairly, left-wing position of, I don't care who they are, I want everyone here, fuck it. What do I care about citizenship? If you can work, you should stay. And then for them to just get shit on like that you know what? It would put someone off, possibly
what I'm talking
forever.
about. That's what I'm talking about. Policing speech is pushing people to the right. Where
It absolutely
it's like,
is, yeah.
if especially like you said, if it's someone's first experience in a forum or
anything
discussion like that, and then they just get shit on.
I mean, let's be materialist here. Let's try and explain why this has happened. I would put forward as a hypothesis that precisely as a result of the utter historic defeat of the working class in the late 1970s and 1980s as a result of neoliberalism, the utter success of the Reaganite, Thatcherite revolution in the Western world,
Let's not forget Mulrooney.
And Mulrooney, of course, absolutely.
Oh, yes, the third stringer.
Precisely because of that success, because the working class is on its back, has seen nothing but defeats for the last 30, 40 years, the left is dislocated from the class. The left is largely located within NGOs and academia and the media. And I talk about myself here. I'm a science writer. I'm not
Part of the club.
I work for a living, so technically I'm formally,
No,
working
you are.
class.
You're proletarianized. Don't worry about it.
But the point being that we are to some extent alienated from the class. When we begin to have these conversations about language like dumb or idiotic or crazy is ableist, it's such an expression of how alienated we are from ordinary people. Ordinary people do not, it's not, you don't use the N-word, you don't say the word faggot. Like, of course, we need to change our language to some extent, but that's not, honestly, if somebody even uses those words, but they're basically good people, like they have a good instinct, I might go at the end of the evening say hey, buddy, maybe you shouldn't use that word that way or whatever. But I wouldn't jump out and make the language the focus of my concern. The other thing with this is, for fuck's sake, really? Is that going to change? Like ableism is a real issue. We have tons of challenges that we face in our country and in the rest of the Western world in terms of lots of working people trying to get jobs. But if you have any sort of disability, you're doubly challenged in terms of trying to access work. Do you really think that the world is going to change for these people if suddenly people stop using the word dumb or crazy or idiotic? No, I know you don't, but it's a lack of materialist analysis.
Yeah, if you prevent someone from saying the word stupid, it's not going to automatically build a wheelchair accessibility ramp somewhere.
Exactly.
Well, it seems like a stand-in almost. Like I can't take any realistic action, so I'm going to nitpick these terms.
Exactly.
It's symbolic, and for a left that has become kind of incapable of getting the goods on any kind of real way. Hey, we can still win the symbolic victories. We can still do. But we can still change the way people talk, and then we can go, "Hey, I'll write a big long stupid book about how important that is." Even if wages between men and women are still divergent, and the issues between races are actually getting worse, and inequality increases.
It's called the linguistic turn. This is within the academy, and it's spread out. It's escaped the campus since the 1980s, but it was called the linguistic turn. That the working class no longer is the revolutionary subject. Now we need to have other sort of revolutionary subjects. We need to have other mechanisms of radical transformation. Could we transform society if we change our language? Let's focus on language.
The answer is no.
The answer is no.
I hope so, because we've given up on trying to change society, so we might as well try to change language.
No, that's exactly it. It is a result of the historic defeat of the class in the late 70s and 1980s. Precisely because the working class, we've given up on the working class as the revolutionary subject, the possibility of radical social change. But maybe, just maybe, Oprah's going to say something nice at the Oscars or whatever.
Next president of the United
States. That's what people look to, right? These dickheads in universities are writing these dumb articles, are talking about the Oscars, when the average person looks at the Oscars and just says, "What a bunch of douchebag Hollywood millionaires! What the fuck do they have to do with my life?"
Well, they also love they're just it's. they're fun. We shouldn't. Oh my God!
Those ceremonies are so
They're
self-aggrandizing
awful and awesome
awful.
at the same time. I mean, like, I spent years being like this good earnest leftist and like, oh, I hate the Oscars, I'm never going to watch it. And then like, it's like, let's not separate ourselves from.
Okay, fine.
It's a good laugh.
No, fine. If anyone has fun watching that, I don't care. Okay, fair enough.
I will not be one of those people.
we-
Okay, so one thing that I think that we should do a little bit more justice to and hash out a little bit more is a comment that I made earlier about, free speech versus hate speech, right? And I think that line is drawn when someone is advocating violence, right? This is the exact point at which the Daily Stormer was taken offline by their domain registrar, right? They were celebrating the murder of a woman who was part of, like a civilian protester, right?
Unfortunately, that's not violence. That might be celebrating violence, but that's not violence. There should not be any sort of distinction that, okay, well, there's a distinction between free speech and hate speech. No, there isn't. Like, if you believe in free speech, you believe in the right of anybody to say however horrific, however horrible, they have the right to say that. We need to defeat their arguments.
Then we get into the point where there is really no argument, where the discussion veers into the threat of actual violence. So it probably seems important to differentiate between free speech, hate speech, and speech that will probably inevitably lead to violence.
Absolutely. I would say, well, I wouldn't say that we should be distinguishing between free speech and hate speech. I think that we should be distinguishing between free speech and violence. When you're advocating, or, well, not even advocating violence, but if you are actively trying to precipitate violence, I think, in the United States, which has probably the best protections, best free speech protections in the Western world, therefore in the world, even there, the moment that you do begin to openly not advocate for violence, but if you are using your speech to
facilitate it?
To facilitate violence, that's the problem. It's not that it's hateful. The problem is when it is actually you're actively trying to incite violence. And so the example that I would give is, in the United States, there's been enormous difficulty going after mobsters when mobsters have basically said, I didn't, and they've worked very hard or they did in the 1970s and 1980s to try to do this. I didn't actually kill Larry or Bubba. I just said to one of my henchmen, go kill Larry and Bubba. That's just free speech. I didn't kill them. I just said kill Larry and Bubba.
Or wouldn't it be nice if they were dead?
Wouldn't it be nice if they were dead? And courts have ruled, and I think this is correct, that no, actually, you have crossed a line there. You are actively trying to incite violence. You have, more than that, you've actually engaged in a contract, an implicit contract, to have somebody killed. That's not free speech anymore. You are actually engaging in violence by doing that. That's the line that I think we should be dividing, that's the line that we should be drawing here, not between free speech and hate speech, but between free speech and actual violence.
Okay, well, that brings up, that begs the question. There's another notorious neo-Nazi website, Stormfront. They've been online since the 1990s, and the members, it's a V-Bulletin site, it's an internet forum, and that site has been linked to like multiple murders and multiple assaults.
Well, when that does actually happen, then that's legitimate to shut that stuff down, but only on the basis of, or rather, not even to shut it down, but if there is an individual who has, on that forum, incited violence, then that person should be prosecuted, but not the site shut down.
Well, and at that point, it's contingent upon the administrators of that website to...
Kind of, but the problem with once we start saying things like it's contingent on the administrators of the website, we are now basically offering ourselves to the Googles of the world. Please, please,
right.
Manage
Decide.
our lives for us. Please tell us what's right and wrong.
It's actually really easy. It's really, really simple. You don't have to shut down any websites or any web forums or anything like that. If somebody on that website has actually incited violence, they are in breach of the law. prosecute them.
Yeah, but then it's contingent upon the administrators
Why?
to that
Why?
website.
No, they don't. They don't have to do anything. They don't have. It's not up to them to be policing what's on their forum.
But
Because if the forum is still allowed, the only reason that they would have to be policing their own website is if the state was going to shut down the website for people on the website or a forum or whatever happens to be inciting violence. They don't have to do it. What I'm saying is, if somebody on the forum has incited violence, prosecute that individual. You don't prosecute the forum.
Sure, but then what if the
seems-
administrators of that site are sympathetic to those very views?
Doesn't matter.
Well, okay,
Doesn't
what if
matter.
there's a protest in a city, for instance, and you, like on the street, downtown Victoria, right, in Centennial Square even, and it's a neo-Nazi protest, which in this city would get, several people
Rocks
to show up.
thrown at them,
many,
probably.
many, individuals.
Actually,
maybe even
in this city, they just get flowers thrown
maybe
at them
even
because
10.
love is stronger than hate.
Yeah, love is stronger than hate. But you wouldn't say like, well, we should prosecute the city council for allowing
Yep.
this to happen.
Yep.
It's like, well, I mean, you should definitely tell. For me, at least, I would be telling those dickheads in City Hall like this was a bad idea and what the fuck are you doing and what the hell's even going on here. But realistically, even if an individual had a megaphone in Centennial Square and said, I want so-and-so murdered, or I'm going to murder so-and-so, or whatever, like you can pick a fucking as extreme a thing as you want to say, that person should be arrested, clearly, and the city manager of the roads and public spaces, well, he what? What do you want to do to him? Nothing, because yeah.
You're very far from your mic.
A little bit, just a wee bit away.
Could you say that again?
We'll get you a lapel mic. How about that?
You can roam.
That's the same as what we're talking about with the forum moderators. They're effectively the the folks of the
City managers.
city
They're
managers,
just
yeah.
even if they own the place, like it's
really easy. Somebody's incited violence. Go after the person who has incited violence, not the publication, not the forum, the web forum, not the website. Just go after the person.
But at what point? I mean, at what point does a forum like become a fucking breeding grounds for this
Climate,
kind of like
yeah.
violence?
Well,
It
vitriol,
actually doesn't
you know?
matter. It doesn't matter.
no. I would say if we're looking for the edge, when a forum or a paper sort of moves from individuals publishing or posting in it to the thing itself, we're now talking about the questions of editorial, decision making. And if there's an editorial board that is itself advocating violence, then once again you can simply prosecute the members of that editorial board for whatever crimes.
If we don't do this, if we don't say that those individuals who are inciting violence are the ones that are the problem, if we now begin to say any publication, and when I say
group.
publication,
Right.
I mean like a web forum or anything like that, we now say that's who has to hold responsibility. What we're now saying is that there has to be some sort of censorship board in the state that is able to assess what can be read and what cannot be read, what can be broadcast and what cannot be broadcast.
Do we want the government to ban the sale of records with lyrics the government doesn't like? Do we want the government to say this is okay, but this one will have to go? And who should be the government censor? Whose job should it be to listen all day to dirty records and decide whether you can? Do you want censorship of records as is now being proposed in Maryland and in congressional hearings, or do you want to make the decision on your own? Take it or leave it, all by yourself.
We're turning back to the 1950s, where most Western states had censorship boards. And do we trust them? We know exactly what will happen at that point. They will assess that things that we on the left are saying to be verboten.
Yeah.
Even more importantly than this, I mean, there was something that, Frederick Douglass, the great anti-slavery campaigner in the United States, said that critiques of free speech are a double violence. The first is, of course, against the person who is speaking. But the second is the audience. There's a violence against the audience. You are preventing them from assessing for themselves what this person is saying, whether this person is saying whether it's true or not true or anything like that. You're saying that there is a group of other people who can a priori assess for the rest of us ordinary people who are totally stupid and will potentially be susceptible to racist speech or fascist speech or whatever. But there's a group of people, censors, who are immune to that and can read that and say and they aren't susceptible to that. So, but that's not even to do with the state, but it's even to do with sort of like popular the idea of popular left censorship. The other day, I was reading on Facebook a guy who was reading Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for whatever
A famously shitty book.
His wanky book.
Wanky. That's a good.
Stand up straight, clean your room.
Anyway, so. This guy believes that Jordan Peterson is alt-right. I think that goes too far. I think he's just a
grifter,
regular run-of-the-mill conservative.
I still maintain he is the premier postmodernist philosopher of our age.
That's probably true. But here's the thing with this is that this person on Facebook, this friend of mine, believes that because he thinks that Jordan Peterson is alt-right, let's just say he is. He isn't, but let's just say he is. Therefore, he should be shut down. He should be censored, not by the state, but by the people, I guess.
In quotes.
The mob.
Every fucking time, it's always the people.
But what he's doing here is in order to be able to assess that Jordan Peterson should be shut down, he needed to read his book. So he's okay. So it's fine for him to read it.
Well, it's the sanctum sanctorum, all right?
That's basically it. It is an elitist, it is a fundamentally elitist, anti-democratic position to argue for censorship of hate speech. It is saying it is okay for me to read this because I'm immune to being. I'm immune to this. I'm not susceptible to this. But ordinary people, they could read this and they could turn into fascists and they could turn into racists if they just read this. We need to be able to know what the bastards are saying. We need to be able to assess it for ourselves.
Avoid some near future where you have some algorithm reading Jordan Peterson's books for us.
But then
presumably
who would be
Google.
writing the algorithms?
Well,
Yeah,
Google
exactly.
would.
And there'd be humans who would be writing those algorithms. So it's still the same thing. But yeah, it's fundamentally an elitist proposition to say that whenever you are trying to censor something, even by sort of the popular censorship rather than the state censorship, you're still basically saying, how else would we figure out what we need to censor if we don't read or listen to the things that need to be censored? So somebody somewhere has to be doing the reading and the listening, but those people apparently are immune to the problems of listening and reading to this work. Well, why are they immune, but ordinary people are not immune? If they just like listen or read these horrible words, they will immediately turn to fascists or racists. So what I mean is it's when I say it's a fundamentally elitist position, it's saying that there's a group of people on the left who know better than everybody else. And isn't what we say from the very beginning as socialists is that we don't think that there are a group of people who are better than other people. We should all be able to, as Frederick Douglass says, we should all be able to, in terms of the double violence, we should all be able to, the audience is being censored as well. We should all be able to assess what somebody is saying.
And I like that idea that the audience is being also censored, because my main motivator in all of this stuff is less about questions like you've talked a lot about how free speech is a bedrock idea, and for me at least, free speech is important, but I would probably put sort of democratic values as my bedrock.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But yeah, the idea that the common people, or there's some people who can't hear an idea, and that's in effect really what a lot of censorship is. Yeah, that does have a real valence for me. Yeah.
Do you know? Let me tell you a bit of a funny story about how I changed my opinion on this. I was in an organization, a socialist organization, for many years that was actually the organization that began in the 1970s to articulate this no platform position, the Socialist Workers' Party in the UK. It spread far beyond that organization since then, but they were sort of the originators in the 1970s, and they made the argument that anytime fascists speak, there is an uptick in racist violence whenever there's fascists that speak. And I used that line over and over and over again when I was a member of that organization, even though deep in my heart I didn't really believe it. But I said it, and I was one of the no platform people. I defended no platforming. I said that it was important. And then I became a journalist in Brussels, and in the aughts, in the 2000s, at a time when there were increasing numbers of far-right organizations that were beginning to win many seats in different European countries. And I wanted to write as a journalist. I mean, most of what I was writing was science journalism, but I also carved out a little bit of a space for writing about the far right. That was one of my sort of niches. I got my editor to allow me to write about the far right because I was really concerned about the rise of the far right in Europe. And so I had to go to far right rallies and stuff like this and write about what they said. And then I immediately thought, like, this no platforming stuff just doesn't work, because in order for me to be able to describe how awful they are and say what they've said,
You have to hear what their
I have
words.
to hear what they've said.
Yeah.
And why?
So I have to publish what
Yeah.
they've said.
But also beyond that, just like, why are your ears,
Well, exactly.
better?
So it's just this. That's exactly right. So it was this immediate contradiction that I just can't. Like, if I were to adhere to my no platform position, it would have to be that I can't write about what they've said, because if I write about what they've said, I've given a platform to them.
Right.
But I needed to write about what they've said so that we knew what they've said.
Right.
Not to dig too much of a hole here, but I think then we get into the issue of people not reading or not hearing and just reacting to, the number of things they see online and getting behind a specific group. But we could talk about that for quite a while.
Well, but that does open up the whole sort of question about, I think the broader context, outside of the left and right, and outside of the universities and no platforming, this whole issue, and I would say the sort of the threat of free speech has a lot, like the situation we're in today, as far as free speech being a right that a lot of people don't care about, has to do more with sort of the state of the media today. And the fact of the matter is that, I mean, journalism is not something people really care about that much because it's kind of shit a lot of the time.
Sorry, Leigh.
Sorry, it's been pretty, like, okay, as my entire life, most of the articles I've ever seen were AP articles, and like quite a few of them didn't even fill in the blanks for those articles they were supposed to be.
Oh, you don't have to apologize. I mean, if you want to talk about how awful journalism has become, speak to any journalist. It's we are more than aware of how awful,
How shite
But
it has
I do think this is sort of
10-15
like
years.
the overarching problem that we're also facing. Yes, the left is, I guess, sort of dicking around and not really knowing what it's doing and taking all these really dumb, short-sighted positions. And then on the other hand, in the broader context, we've got a media that is more and more consolidated, less and less trusted. And in this context, we've got a left wing that is like saying, free speech doesn't matter. And then the broader sort of corporate media is basically being shitty anyway. I don't think it's any surprise that a lot of people look at free speech as kind of like, well, who gives a shit? Like, why does it even matter? Because it's not like I can learn anything from the news anyway. They're just embedded with the military and going off and all that.
But this is precisely...
Hold on, you're a little far from your mic there, comrade.
We should put the... Yeah. We're going to get you a fucking head...
to your face.
We're going to get a head brace.
I was going to say...
A head brace. That's why I want to... Yeah.
But this is precisely why we need to be caring about this stuff. Or rather, this is another reason why we need to be caring about this stuff, is that we are at the moment living in a period of unprecedented restriction of speech. One of the funny things here is that we've just spent about 45 minutes talking about, the left repressing free speech. The reality is that the vast majority of repression of free speech at the moment is happening from the right or from corporations.
Yes, exactly. Right?
This is really why we need to be caring about this, because if we start with focusing on how the left needs to be censoring hate speech or Milo Yiannopoulos or whatever, we're missing the fucking boat. At the moment, I came up with a little bit of a list before I came over here, but so we've been talking about no platforming of speakers, organizations, publications by the liberal left, right, on campus, and or requests that administrations intervene to prevent speech acts from occurring, right?
Yeah.
So that's probably the main thing we've just been talking about for the last 45 minutes.
That's what most people are talking about, yeah.
But we should also be talking about that now that suddenly there's been a copying of these tactics by conservative religious groups and defenders of foreign governments, not least defenders of the Likud administration of Israel, to try to ban BDS activists. Whether we agree or disagree with BDS as a legitimate strategy, we should be definitely supporting their right to articulate that. And that's now extended beyond the campus. There has been an unprecedented clampdown on whistleblowers. The Obama administration was one of the worst for trying to clamp down on whistleblowers.
Oh, the worst. They put more whistleblowers in jail than all previous administrations combined.
I can't remember the exact numbers, but yeah, absolutely. The European Union at the moment is... Yeah, so there's been this extension they're attempting to extend...
They were trying to create a fourth kind of...
Yeah, so there's a fourth category of intellectual property now that is basically releasing of corporate information, and journalists, even local communities, municipalities are very concerned about this because they now are not able to, or potentially will not be able to release freedom of information or respond to freedom of information requests because they're worried about any sort of public-private partnerships they've engaged in, that just any discussion of this might be release of corporate secrets, basically.
Right.
So this is yet another impingement on freedom of speech.
And corporate secrets could apply to basically anything that the corporation knows
That's
that
right.
anyone else doesn't know, which in theory is exactly the kind of thing you'd want to talk about anyway.
So there's also been a radical change in the terrain of war where both state and non-state actors increasingly view journalists as legitimate targets over the last 20 years. Previously, this didn't happen. Again, that's another very serious impingement of freedom of speech that we need to be taking very seriously.
Well,
Certainly
the Palestinian that was killed in Israel just a few days ago.
Yeah.
Well, not even, yes, but not even that. The fact that journalists seem to be getting killed more often and more regularly and with no real repercussions or relevance. It's just well, you're a journalist, who cares?
#Mexico.
Yeah. Absolutely. We've already talked about the murder of journalists and cartoonists by radical Islamist groups. Charlie Hebdo was just one example, but the reality is that across the Middle East, journalists and cartoonists are regularly targeted by Islamists. We should be caring as much about the censorship of those people as we cared about the murder of the cartoonists in Paris and sort of the shooting up in Copenhagen as well. There is intimidation of galleries, museums, theaters, and music festivals by liberal left, but also by conservative religious groups, and they're winning on the basis of the groundwork that the liberal left has laid. Their efforts by governments to engage in censorship or intimidation of the media. Trump is a classic example, but also the UK government, Erdogan in Turkey. Harper was also a famous intimidator of not just journalists, but also scientists, the muscling of scientists, climate scientists, biodiversity scientists.
Classic example, yeah.
It is happening right across, so many areas where we need to be taking free speech very, very seriously. Yeah, so George Bush was big on that. Abbott in Australia. Green activists destroying GM crops are effectively, they're also threatening free speech. They're threatening scientists. So it's not just the conservative governments that are doing this, but also green activists. So there's a researcher at the University of Victoria. who has been engaged in a citizen science project to monitor the level of radioactivity in the waters off the coast of British Columbia as a result of Fukushima. The reality is, it turns out nothing. Like zip. Like not a problem. As a result of his conclusions, he's been targeted, threatened by anti-nuclear activists. He's received death threats, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, there are scientists that are being threatened by both right-wing governments and by left-wing activists. So we've also seen requests for censorship or legal action to be taken against comedians by foreign governments. The most recent example was Turkey with respect to Germany, and Germany acceded to these requests. There was a comedian that was making fun of Erdogan, the president of Turkey. Germany acceded to these requests.
Who is a shithead? Can we just agree?
Absolutely.
Sure.
And then there's been so
any of them, really.
The list of academics that have been recently fired or unhired due to their publicly expressed beliefs. Just in the last few days, there's been, I can't remember the woman's name, at Fresno College, I think it is, who tweeted about how after the death of Barbara Bush, she called Barbara Bush a racist.
Yeah.
And so there's this like Twitter mob trying to get her fired. And the continued use or introduction of blasphemy laws, we've seen that in Quebec and in Ireland. In Canada and Ireland. We've seen burqa and hijab bans in France and Quebec. I don't agree with the burqa. I don't agree with the hijab, but I definitely agree with that the women should have the right to wear whatever they choose to wear.
Well, exactly, right? Like, what are you going to fucking start harassing people wearing babushkas, like little old ladies walking down the street next?
Or
Give it the time.
Or nuns. Trump's attacks on union assaulting, that is to say, people go into union activists who go into workplace and just talk about how a good idea it would be to join a trade union. Trump wants that halted. That's called union assaulting. So that, again, that's the impingement of free speech. And then fundamentally, I think one of the biggest ones that we're facing at the moment is the online spaces that are owned and censored by private enterprises, even as they are today's equivalent of the public square. So Facebook censorship, Lord Zuckerberg's recent essay, or I guess a few months ago, referencing how speech online can be trimmed in line with community standards. Regular efforts by municipalities, police, and private security firms to restrict leafleting, busking, and other quote-unquote annoyances under such vehicles as in the UK, the public service protection orders and antisocial behavior laws. And then, of course, on campus after campus and in city after city, wherever there's any sort of major meeting that goes, any summit, the restriction of protests to designated free speech zones. Sorry, but if there's free speech, there's every zone as a free speech zone.
Well, that's like such a classic example of how fucked up this can get, right? You get your free speech zone, and it's out by the airport, surrounded by a chain link fence, and fuck you.
A corner in an alley.
I mean, I didn't do a count there, but there's I think probably a dozen different examples there of where we are in a real crisis of threats to free speech, right and left. And we need to step up. What I would say is that I would love to see the launch of a new left-wing free speech movement. One of the problems that we face is that there's all these right-wingers who are defending right-wing assholes. But when there are left-wing speakers that are threatened to be unhired or fired, they're not defending them. I think that's hypocritical. Some of them are. I mean, to be fair, Ben Shapiro, who's a nasty motherfucker, right-wing, very popular right-wing speaker and commentator.
He's also very short.
Is he? to be fair, he has actually defended the free speech rights of this woman at, I think, Fresno College. So, that's great. But in general, the right has been very reluctant to defend speech that they don't agree with. They only defend speech that they do agree with.
Well, same with the left, really.
Same with the left. So what we really need is, and when I say we need a new left-wing free speech movement, the left that has not been defending free speech, they aren't really left. They're abandoning our original values. We were the ones who, going back to Marx, Trotsky, Lenin, Frederick Douglass, from the very beginning, we were the ones who were the first ones to articulate defense of free speech. Marx's first writings were actually as a young journalist, and he was horrified to see how peasants and workers were being treated, and he would write about this, and he was being censored, and so he articulated a really amazing defense of free speech. He said that we can't defend these people if we don't have the ability to write about their struggles. So the very beginning of our struggles is a fight for free speech. So when I say that we need a revitalized left wing, a progressive movement for free speech, I'm saying that I do think that there's a distinction between the hypocrisy of the right and those pseudo-leftists that are opposing free speech. I don't think they're on the left. I think that what we really need is a return to original Marxist, socialist, left liberal values. We were the originators of the free speech fight. I think we just need to recover them because nobody else is going to do it. The liberals' liberal defense of free speech, they are no good either.
Well, they're fine. They're happy. Everything's good. Everything's fine.
Well, except for, Obama, classic liberal. He was, as we were talking about just a few minutes ago, one of the biggest suppressors of whistleblowers in the history of.
But still, if you asked Obama, is free speech healthy in America? He'd be like, yeah, sure, whatever.
Except where I disagree. So he worked so hard to clamp down on whistleblowers, particularly from the Pentagon.
Yeah.
So we can't trust liberals to defend free speech. We can't trust the right to defend free speech. We certainly can't trust the pseudo-left to defend free speech. What we do need is a new Anglosphere-wide, I think worldwide, radical left movement for free speech. I think given the scale of repression of free speech at the moment, it should be one of our major priorities.
Well, I basically agree with you there. I do think, however, that I do think that the left or pseudo-left, as you put it, is personally I'd consider them basically left-wing. My problem with their position on free speech is how defensive it is, how conservative it is, how we can't convince people, so we might as well just build this bulwark and just hold out indefinitely. I think that a lot of this, the situation the left is in right now is as you said, a consequence of the 1970s, 1980s kind of reaction. And that I think the left, my appeal is that we need to be going out and fighting for, convincing people of our ideas and not simply hiding in whatever areas we can, building these bulwarks, these defensive walls of saying you can't, bad ideas can come here and no further. And so therefore we have this nice little area we can operate within. No, we need to be able to go wherever we need to, fight for the ideas we believe are right, and do that as broadly as possible. And like you said, do that requires a robust defense of free speech.
Absolutely, yeah.
But that's more my position is. I mean, I'm more just sympathetic to the people who have taken this more conservative, reactionary position.
Obviously, on a day-to-day basis, a lot of these people, you're going to see them on the same picket line. They're going to be taking progressive positions in a range of different other things.
Yeah.
So we need to make a strong argument. The very first thing that we need to be doing is probably not just dismissing them. We need to be making strong arguments. And I hope that this podcast and other essays and stuff that some leftists that are defending free speech, I think that hopefully that will begin to change people's minds. But I think sort of some of the next steps that we need to be doing is, absolutely. The next time that there's any sort of left movement on campus or elsewhere to shut some right-wing speaker down, I'm sorry, but I think that we need to mobilize a counter. We need to be participating in the demonstration against that right-winger, but the minute that they try to shut them down, we need to have a counter mobilization against that or try to stop that from happening. But if we only do that, if we only focus on the pseudo-left anti-free speech people, we will immediately be marginalized. So we have to make sure that we be just as robust anytime that any left-wing speakers are shut down. The problem at the moment that we're facing is organizations like FIRE in the United States, which is this really amazing civil liberties on campus organization, but they do tend to focus very much on defending right-wing speakers. And I think that the way that we do this, the only way that it's going to work is if we defend everybody, no matter what they are saying, that we make a really, what was his name? George Chicaralio Mar, this guy who wrote this book for Jacobin on Venezuela. He's a provocateur online. I think he's a turnip. He says ridiculous things.
The worst kind of root vegetable.
Last American Thanksgiving, he said, at Christmas, he said, the only thing I want for Christmas is white genocide. He happened to be white himself, so that's kind of amusing. I mean, he's obviously joking. It's not a particularly nice joke. It's actually pretty horrific and racist, but it's obviously a joke. And there were enormous threats to his position as an academic, and I think that we should have defended him despite the fact that he was a turnip. I think every single time these things happens in our locality, we need to be robustly defending whoever they are, and also beginning to have more robust conversations about things like Facebook and Twitter and Google and their increasing proclivity towards censorship and mobilizing around that. I think that's the second thing that we really need to be doing. And I think the reason I say that is because I think there's a lot of people who are really sympathetic to that position, and it's a great way to mobilize around free speech. And also just to clarify that these people they're businesses. The only thing they're interested in is making money. If the minute that free speech is any threat to them, as much as Lord Zuckerberg says he's in favor of free speech.
I like that you say Lord Zuckerberg.
That's good. He sounds like something from
Game of Thrones.
Yeah, well, no, I was thinking more like, what was that 70s film that Queen had the soundtrack to? Flash Gordon.
Flash Gordon.
Yeah. It's like a real Flash Gordon name, right? Like he's a Flash Gordon villain. It's a nice wedge. We don't just have to be talking about free speech at that moment. We can now immediately begin to move the conversation to being about the market. And why can the market not defend free speech? Because if you're a business, and the minute that anything begins to impinge your profitability, as much as you might say that you're in favor of free speech, you will shut that down. So it immediately moves to a conversation about the potentials of socialism and why capitalism cannot defend free speech.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point, because like if we take the conversation that we've just had and just like at a broad look, it seems that the main problem here is that we're relying on private companies and individuals to sort of like use their own judgment to determine what's allowed to be said and what's not.
For us, yeah.
Yeah, and it, at the end of the day, it affects whatever affects their bottom line, whatever affects their PR, whatever affects their own corporate policies or whatever. But in the final analysis, if we actually want to defend free speech, that this is something that this should be more community based. This should be more democratic, and it shouldn't be based on. And I don't mean like mob rule, but it at the very least, it shouldn't be contingent upon private companies.
This is it. Is that there's two ways of two nice bookends here. We need free speech in order to mobilize for socialism. We need that as a sort of like foundation, because if we don't have free speech, we can't organize, we can't talk to each other. But at the same time, there's no true realization of free speech under capitalism, because the bosses, the private corporations, will always shut down free speech the minute that it impinges their profitability.
The private corporations who own the internet, basically.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
But also in our daily workplace, like there is no free speech at our workplace. Like if you can't say to your boss, that's a totally stupid idea. I think you're an asshole as well. And you can't say any of these things.
I've said that to my boss before.
Well,
It was Warren.
But I'm good at my job, so...
in general, it is
So
very...
some circumstances, eh?
But all joking aside, we recognize that there is no free speech in the workplace. There's free speech in the public square. There's free speech in Parliament. We protect free speech in society, but the island of censorship. There's dozens and hundreds and thousands of islands of censorship that we totally accept. And that's every single workplace.
Well,
You can't say what you... So basically what I'm saying is that in order to fully have free speech, we have to have socialism. We need free speech in order to build for socialism, but we can't fully have free speech until we have socialism.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's that very same thing about, we have democracy on a sort of,
Limited level.
limited way of we can choose our representatives every 4 years, but every single day when we go to work and we spend 8 hours a day at work, there is no democracy there.
It is what Noam Chomsky calls a private tyranny. That everybody goes around, nobody notices that even though we live in a supposedly democratic society, and Canada's formally not a republic, but effectively it's a republic. Nobody notices that every single workplace is a private tyranny.
Yeah.
Your boss just tells you what to do, and you just have to do it.
Yeah. No questions
No
asked.
questions asked. And so, in all of these cases, why did we begin with this concern about democracy and these concerns about civil liberties back, 300 years ago? And when the division in the French National Assembly, when we first came up with the term left and right, it was that beating heart was the demand for civil liberties, was for democracy, those two things. And by the late 19th century, the advent of socialist philosophy, that we realized that you can't get all of these wonderful liberal freedoms that were promised in the American Revolution and the French Revolution. That you have to have socialism because the market undermines these wonderful civil liberties, these wonderful freedoms. So when we come across any leftist or pseudo-leftist that says, freedom of speech, civil liberties, that's a bourgeois bagatelle. It's like, no, the whole fucking point is, of course we love civil liberties, but they can't be fully realized under capitalism. But at the minute that we begin to throw those away, we turn into Stalinism. That's
We're abandoning the fight for socialism.
That is
exactly, we're abandoning socialism.
Yeah.
It's while look, much like appealing to the UN, it's I will criticize both the Canadian state and the UN, and both criticize the charters of Canada and the charters of the UN for being incomplete or incoherent or inapplicable under capitalism. But those principles do need to be defended.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Because not just because they're valid, but also because that's actually what people care about.
Yeah. Yep.
People look to Canada or to the UN or to any kind of institution, and they say, there's something about these ideas that I like. I like the idea that I can live in a country where I can say what I think,
Yep.
where I can vote for who I want, where I can move to whichever city I wish to move to. And those are things that, limited under capitalism, truncated and kind of bullshit at times, let's be honest, right? You can't really move across this large country just willy-nilly. It's based on how much money you got and can you pay for a plane ticket. But there is something to that. And I think the leftists who sort of abandon these limited gains for this kind of idealistic, maximalist sort of it's all or nothing and nothing else matters, are basically just doing what the left has been doing for quite a while, which is isolating itself from the broad masses of the population.
It's a lovely, lovely thing that most ordinary people love freedom of speech. They love civil liberties. They love liberal
it's
freedoms.
Great.
That's
right?
great.
Like I can just go down to a fucking coffee shop and just talk to anyone about whatever the fuck I want.
It's deeply popular. Deeply popular.
What's the big fucking deal here?
And this goes back to one of the reasons why this is completely isolating for the left is, like, we are taking a position which is deeply unpopular here if we are opposing free speech. People love this shit. People hate the idea that anybody should censor themselves. They get it deep in their heart. That's a wonderful thing. And that didn't always that's not always been there. It's taken 300 years for us to win the idea that, like, deep in people's hearts, that free speech is so important. For a long, long time, that was most people just accepted, well, if the church says that's what I have to say, that's what I have to say. Or if the king says that's what I have to say, that's what I have to say. They just accepted that as the normal way of doing things. Nobody believes that anymore. That's a wonderful thing. What we need to do is expand that and get people to say, okay, so I'm fine with being able to disagree with the government, and I'm fine with being able to disagree with different religions, but why can't I disagree with my boss?
So in conclusion, SJWs are Stalinists?
What are you, a right-winger? Fuck you. You're off this podcast. No platform.
I'm the fucking
just
producer.
Mac.
You can't censor me.
I will record this podcast from a hole in the ground if that's what it
Well,
takes.
no, I wouldn't say that. Well, yeah, yes, yes,
Kind
yes,
of.
they are. I would throw out that they are more akin to Pol Pot, who was a Stalinist of a certain description. That's
Oh, well, no.
You're saying
Okay.
campus liberals are Pol Pots?
I think.
well, okay. I've had a few beers now, so
No, I think.
like.
I know. Shut up, Ben.
But yes,
I can
I
fucking
would say,
ha-
my God, I certainly hope these people never get state power.
That's fair.
Imagine what they would do.
Nobody is allowed to say the word stupid.
Yeah,
Nobody is allowed to say the word dumb. Nobody is allowed to say the word disabled.
No,
Well,
that is not far from saying no one can wear glasses.
Yes,
and that's
absolutely.
the problem
Yeah,
here
yeah.
because it's so. I mean, this is why I think it's the undemocratic part of most of this censorship really fucking irks me. Even we've talked about this a bit, but even more than just the free speech thing, it's the undemocratic part of it. How arbitrary much of this is. How so obviously personal these censorships are. There's clearly just people, individuals, just making decisions, and they expect us to follow them. And it's this kind of like, well, you don't say stupid. Well, who decided that? Well, a committee of 2 people or 3 people that the
Self-appointed.
Yeah, self-appointed pieces of shit, and that is realistically how most of this shit goes. And
I love how this podcast goes because whoever listens to this is like, well, like clearly the trajectory of the discussions like involved a series of beverages that they've had over the course of the.
Absolutely.
What beverages? What are you talking about?
Yeah, I don't know what you're saying. I don't know what you're sorry, I meant I don't know what you're saying at all.
But in all seriousness, I do think you've really hit the nail on the head there. Like we need to be able to ask ourselves on the left, like we fucked up. We fucked up not just once, not just twice, but multiple times. Why did we fuck up? What happened in Soviet Russia? What happened in Maoist China? What happened in Cambodia? Why did these things happen? Could it not possibly be, and I'm putting it out here, could it not possibly be that a group of self-selecting individuals decided that these civil liberties, such as free speech, etc., were these bourgeois bagatelles that were just too unimportant, given how important the fight against the foreign imperialists was? Could it not possibly be that we joked a few minutes ago, or the SJW is just today's Stalinists? Like, well, no, in the sense that they aren't killing anybody at the moment, and they don't have state power, but
those two things are related.
Is the philosophy behind this in terms of a self-selecting anti-democratic group that has decided on behalf of everybody that they can censor the rest of us. They themselves can read what the right-wingers have said, but they don't dare let anybody else read it. How similar is that to the same people who began to take over the Soviet Union under Stalin? How similar is that to the same people who led China, who orchestrated the killing fields in Cambodia?
That is a fucking wonderful summary. And
a terrifying perspective for, universities around the world that, God, isn't it great that these guys don't actually have any real power? And that's pretty terrible.
We always need to be on the lookout for those things, because we've done this many times now in the course of the 20th century. We've gotten it really wrong. So we always have to be on the lookout for those same sort of tendencies, those groupthink, group psychology sort of moments where this just repeats itself. It happened with the Red Army faction in Germany. It happened with the Red Brigades in Italy, over and over and over again. I think we need to be able to actually have an analysis of what is it on the left that begins to fuck shit up. And I think this is it.
Everyone, comrades, thank you for listening. Thanks for tuning in. Podcasting from the Gulag Archipelago of Soviet Kazakhstan. Please do follow us on SoundCloud. Please do follow us on Twitter @RealUlf. We have a Facebook page and we update it sometimes. And if you want to buy us a beer, we're on Patreon.
And we'll keep talking and keep free speeching until we're stopped.
Until SoundCloud,
until some leftist organization no platforms us.
There you go.
Beautiful.
Oh, you watch. There's gonna be like this total like Twitter storm where like, fucking boycott Real Ulf.
I wish. That would be great.
Hey, there's no such thing as bad press.
Relevant because you have repeatedly, in opposing even ratings for rock music, you have repeatedly cited the Constitution and the First Amendment. Do you think the Founding Fathers really had the First Amendment, that they gave us the First Amendment to defend songs that glorify Satanism and incest and suicide? Do you really believe
Absolutely.
that? You really believe that?
Yeah, I believe it.
You're an idiot then.
Yeah?
You're an idiot.
Tell you what.